The applause started before I even processed what had happened. 40 people sat in the main conference room at Vantage Systems on a Thursday morning, clapping for Marcus Webb. He stood at the front of the room in a pressed navy suit, smiling like a man who had just been handed everything he ever wanted. The slide behind him read, Director of Technology Operations. His name was in bold. Then he turned to the room and said it casually like it was a footnote. And Brooke will be transitioning into a support implementation role, which will be a great fit for her skill set. He smiled at me when he said it, a smooth, practiced smile. I felt my jaw tighten. I kept my face still and nodded once, the way you do when something lands like a punch and you refuse to let anyone see the impact. Around me, a few colleagues glanced in my direction. Most looked away quickly. The room continued to applaud. Marcus continued to smile. And then he turned back to the projection screen, clicked to his next slide, and said 7 words that made my stomach drop. Let me tell you about the system I built. The slides were polished. I had to give him that. Marcus had hired a designer to put the presentation together, and whoever had done the work had done it well. Bold graphics, clean typography, confident language. The title on the first content slide read, Vantage Automation Platform, a Strategic Vision. His name sat beneath the title. Just his. I had seen automation platforms described in presentations before. I had written several myself. But this one was different because every single system illustrated on those slides, every workflow trigger, every integration node, every architectural decision being described as his strategic vision, was something I had built. The code was mine. The architecture was mine. The logic that connected every process in that platform had come from my brain, my keyboard, and my late nights. I had built it before Marcus Webb had ever set foot in this building. He stood at the front of the room and walked the team through it like a tour guide explaining a monument he had personally erected. He did not say my name once. Not as a contributor. Not as a collaborator. Not in any context at all. When he finished, the team applauded again. 2 colleagues in the front row were nodding with what looked like genuine admiration. I sat in the 3rd row and said nothing. My name is Brooke Carter. I am 35 years old, and until that Thursday morning, I had held the title of Senior Systems Architect at Vantage Systems for 2 years. Before that, I spent 18 months as an independent consultant, brought in specifically to build the company's automation infrastructure from scratch. The project was the most demanding of my career. I spent 11 months designing, coding, testing, and refining a platform that would eventually handle over 70% of the company's internal operations. Scheduling, resource allocation, billing workflows, client reporting pipelines. I built all of it. When the platform launched, it worked so well that the company saved an estimated $1.4 million in its first operational year. The board praised the result. The CEO sent a company-wide email. My name was in it. That was 2 years ago. Then Vantage hired Marcus Webb as operations manager 18 months back. I had been told he was brought in to help scale the platform's reach across departments. I was told I would remain the technical lead. I was told a lot of things. I believed them, right up until that Thursday morning when Marcus stood at the front of a room and introduced a system I built as something he had created. When Marcus first arrived at Vantage, I was the one who trained him. There was no formal onboarding program for someone stepping into his role, so HR asked me to walk him through the platform. I agreed without hesitation. That was my first mistake. For 3 weeks, Marcus and I sat together in the small meeting room on the 2nd floor every morning from 9 to 11. I walked him through every layer of the system. I explained the workflow triggers, the conditional logic, the API integrations, the fail-safe protocols. I gave him admin-level walkthroughs so he could understand how the back end was structured. He took detailed notes in a black notebook he carried everywhere. He asked sharp, focused questions that showed he was paying attention. At the end of our third week, he closed his notebook and looked at me with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. "Brooke," he said, "you are an absolute lifesaver. I would be completely lost in this role without you." I smiled and told him it was no trouble. Then I did something I later spent a long time thinking about. Because he needed to test certain functions independently, I gave him a level of system access that technically exceeded what his role required. I trusted him. I should not have. The shift was subtle at first. So subtle that for weeks I convinced myself I was imagining it. It started in team meetings. Marcus would lean forward slightly during one of my explanations and say with a patient smile, "Let me just simplify what Brooke is getting at here." Then he would repeat, almost word for word, what I had just said. The room would nod. Sometimes people laughed politely, as if he had translated something complicated into plain language. I had been speaking plain language, but Marcus had a way of filling space with confidence that made people turn toward him automatically. Over the following 2 months, the pattern continued. My ideas entered the room through my mouth and exited attributed to his perspective. Projects I had scoped were presented with his name at the top. In one strategy session, a proposal I had submitted in writing 3 days earlier was described by Marcus as something he had been developing. Nobody had read my original submission carefully enough to notice. Then, on a Monday in early October, HR sent a company-wide email with an updated organizational chart attached. I opened it at my desk and stared at it for a long time. The new organizational chart placed Marcus at the top of the technology division with a direct reporting line to the CEO. My name sat 3 levels below his, in a box labeled Support Implementation Lead. It was not a title I had agreed to. It was not a title anyone had discussed with me. It had simply appeared on a chart and been distributed to the entire company as established fact. I sat at my desk and did the math that I suspected everyone in my position eventually did. My mortgage payment was due on the 1st of every month. My student loans had 12 years left on them. My health insurance was tied to my employment. A title change advantage would mean a salary review, and a salary review tied to a support implementation role would mean a significant reduction. I was not just losing credit. I was potentially losing financial stability. I took a breath and opened a blank document. I began writing a detailed record of everything I had built, with dates, version histories, and code commit logs that I had stored in my own backup repository. Then Marcus sent me a calendar invite for a performance review scheduled for the following Friday. I accepted it without comment and continued building my documentation. The performance review lasted 40 minutes. Marcus sat across from me at the small table in his new corner office and spoke in the warm, measured tone of someone who had prepared carefully for a difficult conversation. He told me I was highly technical. He said it like a compliment, but the slight pause that followed made the meaning clear. Technical was a ceiling in his vocabulary, not a foundation. But leadership, he continued, is really about vision, about seeing the bigger picture and guiding the strategy. He smiled. I nodded and waited. He spent the next 15 minutes describing the automation platform in glowing terms, referring to it as a tool the team had refined together. Together. That word sat in my chest like something hard and cold. He used it 3 more times. Then, near the end of the meeting, he leaned forward and said he wanted all technical documentation properly centralized. He asked me to prepare a full system ownership document, a complete record of every component, every license, every third-party integration. He wanted it on his desk by the end of the month. I told him I would take care of it. That evening, I went home and opened my original consulting contract for the first time in over 2 years. The contract was stored in a folder on my personal hard drive labeled Vantage 2021 Consulting. I had not opened it since signing my full-time employment agreement. I pulled it up and read through it slowly, the way you read something when you suspect it contains something important. The original consulting engagement, signed 3 years earlier before I transitioned to full-time, had covered the design and development of the automation platform. At the time, I had built it under my own LLC, Carter Systems LLC, before the company absorbed the work into their operations. And there it was in Section 7, Subsection 3, written in standard but unambiguous legal language. The master software license for the automation platform had been registered under Carter Systems LLC. The license was structured as an annual renewable agreement. The company had the right to operate the software as long as the license remained active and renewal terms were honored. I checked the renewal date. 90 days away. I set the contract down and sat very still for several minutes. Marcus had asked me to prepare a system ownership document. He had no idea what that document was actually going to reveal, and he had absolutely no idea that the renewal was coming. I did not call a lawyer immediately. I waited 2 days, then reached out to a technology and intellectual property attorney named Patricia Olson, recommended by a former colleague. I explained the situation clearly: the original consulting agreement, the LLC registration, the licensing structure, and the current circumstances at Vantage. Patricia reviewed the documents over the weekend and called me Monday morning. Her assessment was direct. Yes, Carter Systems LLC held the master software license. Yes, the company was operating under that licensing agreement, meaning their access to the platform depended on keeping the license in good standing. Yes, a change in my employment status or role could provide legal grounds to revisit renewal terms, since I was the sole principal of the LLC and the named licensor. Then she told me something I had not fully appreciated until she said it plainly. The license had never been transferred to the company. Marcus could announce operational control all he liked. He could reorganize my title and redistribute my responsibilities. But the software running 70% of Vantage's internal operations still legally belonged to me. 3 days after that call, Marcus sent a company-wide email announcing full internal ownership of the automation platform. The email arrived at 8:47 on a Wednesday morning. I was at my desk when I saw the notification. Subject line: Exciting platform update, full operational control. Marcus had written it in the confident tone he used for all company communications. He described the automation platform as a core asset of Vantage's technology infrastructure. He said the team had worked to bring full operational control in-house. He outlined plans to expand functionality over the coming quarters. The email was addressed to the entire company and CC'd to the board. It included a section thanking the technology team for their contributions. My name was not in that section. I saved a copy to my personal drive and forwarded it to Patricia. Then I sat back and thought about what Marcus had just done. By announcing full operational control, he had made a claim that was not legally accurate. He had done it in writing. He had done it in front of the board. And he had done it with no knowledge of what was sitting in my files. I did not reply with a correction. I did not post a response. I simply waited. 3 days later, the automated renewal notice was generated by the licensing system and delivered directly to Vantage's accounting department. Accounting processed the renewal notice the same way they processed everything, efficiently and without reading the details closely. They forwarded it to the head of the relevant department, which, under the new organizational structure, was Marcus. He received it on a Friday afternoon. I know this because he forwarded it to me 22 minutes later with a single line of text. "Hey Brooke, can you handle this one?" I read the message. Then I read it again. He had forwarded a licensing renewal notice for software I owned and asked me to take care of it, the way someone asks an assistant to pay a routine bill. I typed my reply carefully, keeping the language neutral and factual. Hi Marcus. Just to clarify, this renewal is processed under Carter Systems LLC, which is my LLC. I'm the licensor on this agreement. Happy to discuss the renewal terms. I hit send. On his end, the typing indicator appeared almost immediately. 3 dots. I watched them. They disappeared. They came back. Then they disappeared again. 20 minutes later, he sent a calendar invite. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning. The subject line read, "Quick Sync System Documentation." It was not going to be a quick sync. We both knew that, even if only one of us understood exactly why. Marcus arrived at the Tuesday meeting with a printed copy of what appeared to be an internal asset register. He set it on the table and tapped it once, like a man presenting evidence. He said the company considered the automation platform an internal asset and the documentation simply needed updating. Then, he said the words I had been waiting for. "We should just transfer ownership." I let a moment pass before responding. I told him clearly and without emotion that intellectual property of this nature was not simply transferable. It was not a desk or a laptop that could be reassigned on a form. The license was a legally registered agreement tied to my LLC. Any transfer of ownership required a formal negotiation, a purchase agreement, and fair market compensation. He said he was sure we could work something out informally. I told him informal was not an option for something with this level of legal and financial weight. I watched his expression shift. Not dramatically, just enough. The slight tightening around his eyes. The brief recalibration of his posture. He had not read the original licensing agreement before this meeting. I was almost certain of that. 3 days later, the board's finance committee requested a copy of all active software contracts. The board's finance committee reviewed the licensing agreement on a Thursday. I was not in that meeting, but Patricia had advised me on what to expect, and she had been right about almost everything. When the committee pulled the contract and read Section 7 carefully, the room apparently went very quiet. The committee chair, a careful and experienced man named Arthur Crane, sent a formal written inquiry to the CEO by end of day. The inquiry noted that the company's automation platform, which supported 70% of internal operations, was operating under a third-party software license. It further noted that the license was registered to Carter Systems LLC, a company wholly owned by a current Vantage employee. And then it noted that the employee in question had recently been demoted. I received a call from the CEO's office the following morning. Not from Marcus. From the CEO directly. He asked me to join an executive briefing on Monday. His assistant was careful and professional on the phone, but the urgency beneath the politeness was unmistakable. The board had just realized that the operational foundation of their company was not something they owned. And somewhere in that realization, a question had formed that nobody on that committee could cleanly answer. Why, exactly, had Brooke Carter been demoted? Before the Monday briefing, HR conducted a rapid internal review. I learned from a colleague named Faye Morton, who worked in the people operations team, that the review had been initiated following a specific request from 2 board members. They wanted to understand the circumstances of my role change and whether the process had been properly documented. What HR found during that review opened a second line of concern entirely. Over the previous 6 months, 3 employees in the technology division had submitted informal complaints through the internal feedback system. All 3 described similar experiences. Ideas they had raised in meetings had been restated and attributed to Marcus in follow-up communications. Proposals that originated with specific team members had been presented by Marcus to senior leadership without proper credit. One complaint used the phrase systematic idea appropriation. The HR director, a thorough woman named Constance Bell, compiled the findings into a formal summary and presented them to the board alongside the licensing discovery. The 2 issues, when read together, told a story that was difficult to dismiss as coincidence. And then, on Friday afternoon, the Investor Relations Office received a formal request from 2 institutional stockholders. They had been briefed on the operational risk disclosure and wanted a full risk assessment completed before the next quarterly earnings call. The pressure inside Vantage was building in every direction at once. The Monday board briefing was held in the executive conference room on the top floor of the Vantage building. I had been in that room twice before, both times for milestone presentations celebrating platform achievements. This time, felt different from the moment I walked in. Arthur Crane sat at the head of the table. 3 other board members sat along the left side. The CEO, a measured man named Philip Garrett, sat at the far end. Marcus was also in the room, seated along the right wall in a chair that was notably not at the table. I was given the chair directly across from Arthur. For the first time in months, I was being asked to speak without anyone preparing to interrupt or reframe what I said. Arthur asked me to walk the board through the automation platform architecture. I did exactly that. Clear, precise, plain language. I explained how the system was structured, which departments depended on it, what would happen operationally if it were taken offline, and the realistic timeline for replacing it if the licensing situation were not resolved. The board listened without interrupting. At the end, Arthur looked briefly at his colleagues, then turned back to me. "Ms. Carter," he said, "what do renewal terms typically look like for a license of this scope?" I had prepared for that question carefully, spending the previous weekend working through the numbers with Patricia and a financial consultant she had referred me to. I told the board that Carter Systems LLC was open to a renewal under updated terms, and I outlined 3 components. First, an adjusted annual licensing fee reflecting the platform's current operational scale and the revenue it had generated since launch. Second, a formal strategic advisory role with a defined scope and executive-level access. Third, reinstatement of my original title and seniority in the organizational structure. I noted that if those terms were not agreeable, Carter Systems LLC would consider its options regarding the renewal. I did not raise my voice. I did not lean forward. I kept my hands still on the table and spoke in the same measured tone I had used to describe the architecture. From across the room, Marcus spoke for the first time. He said the proposed terms were excessive and that other options existed for modernizing the infrastructure. Arthur looked at him for a moment without expression. Then he turned back to me and said the board would need 24 hours to deliberate. During the deliberation period, Arthur Crane asked Marcus a direct question in a closed session I was not part of. I learned the details of what happened from Philip Garrett, who called me the following evening. Arthur had asked Marcus a single question. When had he first become aware that the automation platform operated under an external licensing agreement? Marcus had said he had assumed the software was internal company property. He had assumed it had been developed on company time with company resources and was therefore owned by Vantage. He had assumed this despite having been trained on the system by me for 3 weeks, despite having been copied on documentation referencing Carter Systems LLC, despite having asked me to prepare a full system ownership document that, had he read carefully, would have made the licensing structure obvious. Arthur Crane had reportedly looked at Marcus for a long time after that answer. Then he said 4 words that Philip relayed to me with a slight dryness in his voice. Assumptions cost the company. The board also reviewed the timeline of Marcus's employment at Vantage against the timeline of my role change. The progression was clear and documented. He had arrived, been trained by me, built his authority on the platform I created, and then demoted the person whose work had made all of it possible. The formal leadership review was initiated that same afternoon. The audit that followed the leadership review was conducted by an external firm. They were thorough. They pulled email records, document version histories, meeting notes, and internal communication logs going back 18 months. What they found in the document trail was the piece of the story that shifted everything from professional negligence into something more deliberate. In the version history of the platform's internal technical documentation, the audit team identified 11 separate instances where my name had been removed from draft documents and replaced with language describing the work as a team effort or as Marcus's initiative. The removals had not happened simultaneously. They had happened gradually over a period of 4 months, in a pattern that looked intentional rather than accidental. The edits had all been made from Marcus's admin credentials. The timestamps corresponded to evenings and weekends. In 3 of the documents, The original version containing my name was still recoverable in the cloud backup system. The external audit team flagged the finding formally and submitted their report to the board with a one-word classification in the summary column next to the documentation pattern. The word was intentional. Vantage's legal counsel reviewed the report and identified a potential breach of fiduciary responsibility in the actions of a person in a leadership role who had taken deliberate steps to misrepresent the origin of a company asset. The technical team's assessment came next, and it produced what the board later described as the clearest argument for resolution. One of the senior engineers, a careful and methodical man named Troy Whitfield, submitted a written analysis to the board addressing a question that had apparently been raised internally. Could the platform be migrated to internally owned software if the licensing situation could not be resolved? Troy's answer was detailed, honest, and deeply inconvenient for anyone hoping for a quick fix. The automation platform had been built with a proprietary architecture that was tightly integrated into every major operational system at Vantage. Migrating to a new platform would require rebuilding every integration from scratch, retraining staff across multiple departments, running parallel systems during a transition period to avoid operational disruption, and managing the inevitable failures that came with any infrastructure change of this scale. His estimated timeline for a responsible migration was 18 months at minimum. His cost estimate, accounting for development, testing, staff time, and operational risk, was between $2 and $3 million. He added a final note at the bottom of the report, written without editorial comment. The platform's current annual licensing fee was a small fraction of that figure. An emergency board vote was scheduled for the following Thursday. The renewal deadline was 11 days away. In the 8 days between the emergency vote announcement and the vote itself, the mood inside Vantage changed visibly. Marcus had been placed on temporary administrative leave pending the completion of the leadership review. The formal notice had been delivered to him on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, word had spread through the office in the quiet, efficient way that significant information always traveled. My demotion, which had never been finalized in the HR system because the salary adjustment was still pending review, was formally frozen. I was notified of this in writing by Constance Bell, who was carefully professional in her language, but whose email, when read closely, made clear that the ground had shifted. The most telling change was the one I noticed in small moments. Colleagues who had been averting their eyes in hallways for the past several months started making eye contact again. A few stopped by my desk to say hello. One teammate named Iris Cole stopped me near the coffee station on a Wednesday and said, without elaborating, we all knew. We just didn't know how to say it. I thanked her and did not say much more. I was focused on the days ahead. The renewal deadline was close. The board was preparing to vote. And Marcus, sitting at home on administrative leave, had no seat in the room where the decision would be made. The board vote took place on a Thursday morning. I was asked to be present, but was not in the room during deliberation. I sat in a small waiting area outside the executive conference room and read through my notes without absorbing much. Patricia had called the night before to walk me through possible outcomes. She reminded me that regardless of the vote, my legal position was solid. At 11:14, the door opened and Philip Garrett stepped out. He crossed the room to where I was sitting, and I stood. He extended his hand. The board has voted to approve the updated licensing terms. The vote was unanimous. I shook his hand and thanked him. He held it for a moment and added, "We should have seen this more clearly much sooner. I want you to know the board acknowledges that." I nodded. The deliberation had lasted just under 30 minutes. Marcus had not been present. He was still at home on leave. That same afternoon, Constance Bell sent him a formal letter outlining the findings of the leadership review and the legal exposure the company now faced as a result of his actions. It did not request a resignation, but it made clear the board was expecting his response within 5 business days. Marcus submitted his resignation on a Monday, for days after receiving the letter. There was no farewell email to the team, no drinks after work, no card circulating around the office with signatures and well wishes. Just a short internal memo distributed by HR that used the standard language companies used when someone departed under circumstances no one wanted to detail publicly. It said he was pursuing other opportunities and wished Vantage well. Most people read it and moved on. A few colleagues forwarded it to me without comment, as if they wanted me to know they had seen it. I read it once and archived it. 2 days after the memo, Philip Garrett called me into his office. He told me the board wanted to offer me a permanent executive role. The title on the paper he slid across the desk was Vice President of Technology Infrastructure. The compensation was significantly above what I had earned before the demotion. The reporting structure placed me on the same level as the other division heads, with a direct line to the CEO. It was a real offer, a generous one. I could see that Philip expected me to accept it on the spot, or at least to accept it by the end of the week. I asked him for 48 hours to consider it. He agreed, and I could see from his expression that the request had surprised him. I spent those 48 hours thinking more carefully than I had in a long time. The offer was real, the compensation was fair, and the title was everything I had deserved from the beginning. On paper, accepting made complete sense, but I kept coming back to one question I could not put aside. The board had not seen my value until a crisis made it financially impossible to ignore. For 18 months, I had watched my work be claimed by someone else. I had been demoted in front of my colleagues and told that leadership was about vision, not technical expertise. The culture that had allowed that to happen had not changed simply because Marcus was gone. A new title would put me higher in the existing structure, but it would not change the structure itself. I called Patricia. We talked for an hour. Then I called a former colleague named Danny Webb, who had left corporate work 2 years earlier to run her own consulting firm. She talked honestly about what the transition had cost her and what it had given her. By the end of the second day, my decision was clear. I drove to the Vantage offices, asked to meet with Philip and Arthur together, walked into the conference room, and told them I was declining the executive offer. The room went very quiet. Philip looked genuinely surprised. Arthur studied me with the careful attention of someone who was already calculating the next move. I let the silence sit for a moment, and then I told them I had a different proposal. Carter Systems, LLC, would not be renewing under a standard annual license. Instead, I was proposing a long-term consulting contract structured over 5 years, with terms that reflected the platform's true operational value to the company. The compensation was triple what the previous licensing fee had been, paid quarterly. The agreement would include remote working authority, meaning I would not be required to maintain a physical presence at Vantage offices. And the contract contained one non-negotiable clause that I had drafted with Patricia's help and reviewed 3 times before bringing it into that room. All internal and external documentation, past and future, referencing the automation platform would carry an official attribution line crediting Brooke Carter of Carter Systems, LLC as the system's founder and original architect. Arthur asked 2 clarifying questions. I answered both. Then he looked at Philip. Philip looked at the contract on the table between us. Then he picked up the pen. I walked out of the Vantage building that afternoon with a signed 5-year agreement in my bag and the strange, clean feeling of a person who had just chosen their own terms completely. 6 months later, Carter Systems, LLC had 3 active consulting clients. 2 came through referrals from former Vantage colleagues. The 3rd found me through the attribution line on the platform documentation, the one that now appeared on every Vantage technical brief and client-facing report. 2 former colleagues from the technology division had joined me as contracted specialists. We worked remotely, chose our projects, and built something with our names on it from the start. Vantage stabilized under new leadership. Philip brought in a replacement for Marcus, someone more measured and more careful. The quarterly earnings recovered. The automation platform continued running exactly as I had designed it. My name was attached to it permanently in every document and every system brief, exactly as the contract required. I thought about Marcus sometimes. Not often. He had landed at a smaller firm in a diminished role, from what I heard. I did not take satisfaction in that. I had never wanted to destroy him. I had only ever wanted what was mine. He had thought demoting me would shrink my power. He did not understand what he was standing on. He was standing on software he did not own. And when you demote the architect, you better make sure you own the code.